Through crises and, of course, pandemics, governments put in place policies to keep struggling firms in business. But new research presented at the 74th Economic Policy Panel suggests that these well-meaning actions may be creating a different, slow-moving economic crisis of their own. Hello, Boris.
Hello, Tim.
And Ryan, hello.
Hi, Tim.
Now, Boris, you start me off. How do we decide whether a firm is a zombie?
In defining a zombie, one would obviously want to err on the side of caution and not prematurely define a firm as a zombie company. In particular, not every loss-making firm is automatically a zombie company. The firm might suffer a temporary shock, or it might be a young startup that would still require some time to generate profits. So what we do, we propose a definition that defines a zombie firm as a firm that makes losses on a persistent basis, so for a couple of years, and also that has a relatively low stock market valuation for a number of years. So the second part of our definition, this is in fact crucial because it allows us to factor in market's assessment of a firm's profit-generating capacity into the definition of a zombie firm that, in a way, tries to address these caveats that I mentioned at the beginning.
Ryan, how is it that a firm turns into a zombie?
Firms that eventually turn into zombies already have lower profitability, lower stock market valuation, and importantly, lower productivity than their healthier peers. But about 2 years before we define a firm as being a zombie, their productivity worsens substantially. Then what do? They first borrow. They think potentially, it seems as if they think it's going to be a temporary loss of productivity, but then they realize, it's permanent, and then they try and shrink. They sell their assets, they invest less, they lay off workers. That it helps improve productivity a bit. By selling off the least productive parts of the firm, for example, but their productivity never recovers to those of their healthy peers. And so in our process, actually, our paper shows that this process has slowed down. This shrinking process has slowed down since the early 2000s. And interestingly, with every recession, the number of zombies seems to ratchet up. With a permanent level upward shift.
But this shouldn't happen in capitalist economies, should it? We all learn about the principle of creative destruction. Why isn't that working?
Creative destruction is working in a way. So what we find is that zombie firms, in fact, have a much lower survival probability than non-zombie companies. But we still see this increase in zombie shares, in the zombie share over time, as Ryan has mentioned. So after every recession, there's an increase in the zombie share, and that doesn't fully recede in the subsequent recovery. And as a consequence, we have this ratcheting up effect. So the question is then, why does the zombie share not recede in the recovery? So what keeps zombie firms going? And there are two main factors that can be identified. On the one hand, there is the weakness of banks. So when banks have weak balance sheets, then they might be reluctant to write off loans to zombie companies because that might this would eat into their capital and further weaken their balance sheet. So they might have incentives to evergreen loans to zombie firms and keep them afloat that way. Another factor that is related is reduced financial pressure through lower interest rates over time. Right, so what we've seen over the past decades, interest rates have been trending down as well, and lower interest rates on the one hand reduce the cost of rolling over such loans for the banks, so basically reduces the cost of evergreening, but at the same time also induces greater risk-taking incentives more generally. And both these factors, they foster credit supply to zombie companies.
But Ryan, how is it that we've allowed these processes that create and sustain zombies to get baked in, if you will?
There seems to be a kind of self-reinforcing cycle that may be driving this. So with a rising share of zombie firms, banks have more risky firm loans on their assets. And this sort of makes their balance sheets weaker, encouraging potentially more zombie lending. Also, as there's lower productivity, less economic dynamism in the economy, this weighs on aggregate productivity. And when productivity falls, the natural or equilibrium interest rates also fall, which mean that interest rates may be lower, need to be lower to stimulate a given level of demand. But with lower interest rates, then when we end up with more, less financial pressure and potentially more zombies. And then finally, with low interest rates, to close the circle, that weighs on bank profitability, and so then they're less profitable. Then it increases, maybe undermines any incentives the banks had to sort of write off those zombie loans in the first place.
You've done a very useful job, which is to quantify the proportion of firms that are zombies at the moment and in the recent past. Boris, which countries did you look in? How far back did you look?
What we do in our analysis, we use data from the WorldScope database. So these are firm level data, and we use data for 14 OECD countries, and the data go back as far as 1980. Now, the use of these data, the data for these publicly listed companies, has two main advantages for our analysis. On the one hand, it allows us to go back further in time than previous studies. So we can do an analysis that covers several business cycles, and that way also allows us to actually study the trend development of the zombie share over time, covering a couple of decades. The second main advantage is that for publicly listed firms, we can observe the equity valuation of these firms. And this, in a way, enables us to factor in markets' assessment of the future growth potential for a company in the definition of zombie firms, which I mentioned at the beginning is crucial for our approach to defining a zombie.
And so the big question, what proportion of firms are zombies at the moment? And is it really more than it was in the past? We're certainly worrying about it more.
Yeah, our results suggest that around about 17% of listed firms in 2020 were zombie firms. That's increased from around about 4% in the mid to sort of late 1980s. And as Boris said, they've sort of ratcheted up with each recession. Now we have the COVID recession, highly unusual recession. The big question is, we've seen a ratchet up with the COVID recession. Now what's going to happen afterwards? Will they stay up or will they come down again?
The proportion, do you think, Boris, for private firms, are as many of those zombies?
Well, we did not analyze this question as our database only covers listed, right? However, our findings suggest that the proportion of zombie firms amongst private companies could probably be even higher than the proportion that we find amongst listed firms. And the reason is that what we did is that we also calculated the share of zombie companies amongst listed small and medium-sized enterprises. And there we find that the share amongst this group of listed firms is much higher than in the total group. So it goes up to almost 30%. Now, if private companies are more similar to listed small and medium-sized enterprises than to the average listed company, then by association, that would suggest that the zombie share amongst private companies could probably be even higher than the share that we find for the publicly listed firms.
Ryan, clearly this is problematic. It's a very large number of firms, but the question is, what do we do now? Should we just maybe sit tight, hang on, wait for an economic recovery, and maybe the zombies will become unzombified?
So this is exactly what we wanted to do in one of the questions we want to understand in our research. So, and a good deal of our research has in our paper is actually about what happens with recovered zombies. And what we find is that out of our 32,000 firms in our database, around 12,000 of those are classified at least one point in time as zombies, and about 80% of those, sort of 8,000 odd firms, recover. So exactly, should we just wait, let them recover or not? Now, the downside is from our research is the following. Firstly, that these recovered zombies seem to be less dynamic than their healthy peers. They're more likely to become zombies again in the future, and they also have lower productivity. And so, this is the question of should we let them hang on if they have lower productivity, even once they recover? That raises the question of what we should do about it.
Well, what is, when we add all this up together, Boris, the overall effect? Because as Ryan says, they're less dynamic. So are they holding back productivity? Are they lowering growth?
Well, in principle, zombie firms can affect productivity through two main effects. On the one hand, they are themselves less productive. So if you have more zombie companies in the economy, then your overall productivity growth will be lower. At the same time, they may create congestion effects, so they may block resources for more productive firms, and through this channel create additional negative effects on growth potential. Now, how the impact of the zombies on productivity will be going forward, this is hard to tell with any great precision. On the one hand, there's uncertainty around the evolution of the zombie share going forward. At the same time, there's also uncertainty around the precise impact of zombies on productivity growth. Now, what our estimates suggest is that for each percentage point increase in the share of zombie firms, there's a reduction in productivity growth by 0.1 percentage points. Yeah? So the around 10 percentage points or more than 10 percentage points increase in the zombie share that we document since the late 80s, according to these estimates, would have lowered productivity growth by more than 1 percentage point. Yeah. So this is the estimate, but as said, there's of course a high degree of uncertainty around these estimates in the end.
Well, Ryan, you asked what we should do about zombie firms, so to finish off, I'm going to give you the chance to solve the problem. I'm going to make you omnipotent policymaker, and so you can do whatever you want about it. What would you do to solve the problem of zombie firms, and how many zombie firms do you think it's all right to tolerate?
That's a good but tricky question. So the textbook answers include the following: ensure that banks or creditors acknowledge their losses early. So it's a lesson from Japan. The other lesson from Japan was that you want to have efficient insolvency regime, so that when a creditor wants to write off a loan, it's not costly to do so, and it can be done quickly. That ensures that the capital of those firms is then recycled quickly and reallocated to more productive firms, and the same with labor. The good part of the firm is sold off, and the workers in that part retain their jobs. But in addition, our research suggests that the number of zombie firms rises in recessions, as we've discussed a couple of times now, but it never completely falls back in the recovery. And this is related to lower financial pressure. And so what could also be done is raising interest rates. Now, raising interest rates in a recession is probably going to make the problem worse. But what you may want to do, given that the number of zombies never falls back quite to where it was before the recession, is to ensure that interest rates are increased in a timely fashion. And this has the potential benefit of boosting productivity. Now, your second question is, what proportion would you tolerate? Well, given that we find that zombies are less productive when they're zombies, and also when they're recovered, that would suggest that we should potentially a 0% tolerance level. Now, given statistical uncertainty and stuff, then maybe like a 1% or 5%. But certainly not 17% that we see today.
Well, we will see if the real-life policymakers follow your recommendations in the near future, because it's certainly going to be a live question for the next couple of years. Ryan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
And Boris, thank you as well.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Ryan and Boris will be presenting their paper on Friday the 22nd of October at the 74th Economic Policy Panel. If you want to read it beforehand, it's called Corporate Zombies, Anatomy and Life Cycle. Authors, of course, Ryan Banerjee and Boris Hofmann. And if you want to find out more about the Economic Policy Panel, then the link is on screen now.